afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Marguerite Schneider. I'm new to York, and Robert is one of the first people, Dr. Aceves is one of the first people I met at York, literally as I was moving in that day, so I will remember that. What I hope to convey to you is a bit about Dr. Aceves as a person and as a scholar. And he is a person of many perspectives and brings that to York into his research. As you may know, he's director of the CUNY Institute of Aviation here, which was established a few years ago in conjunction with the Port Authority. With support from this institution's many industrial, commercial, academic, and other partners, Dr. Aceves spearheads the effort to promote education and research in the aviation industry internationally, nationally, and locally, with many authorities, airports, airlines, and so forth. Under Robert, the CUNY Aviation Institute aims, and he's working on this now in his second year here, to develop educational approaches of the highest quality. And his goal is a pedagogical approach that's strongly student-centered yet industry-informed, and I think that's a very good combination. He came to York College last year via St. Cloud State University in Minnesota, where he taught a number of aviation courses, and was at Spartan College before that. Interestingly, Dr. Aceves was born and raised in a family of migrant workers in California. I think that's very revealing of the person. He earned his bachelor and master's degrees in engineering-related topics, aerospace and aeronautics, and management operations from Emory-Riddle, which I know is a top engineering school, and his doctorate in school administration from Oklahoma State. He began his aviation career, which is a little independent but linked with his academic career, in high school when he enlisted in Air Force Reserve, and began his career as an aircraft mechanic and later as a flight engineer. 20 years of service to our country, over 100,000 flight hours, including active duty in the Gulf War.
10,000.
Is a decorated combat aviator. We want to clap already, right? Let's not do that yet. Dr. Aceves also holds several commercial pilots and flight instructor licenses. It's a long list. I don't know what any of them mean. I figured you wouldn't either, so I skipped that. His military awards include Meritorious Service Medal, Kuwait Liberation Medal, 2002 Chuck Yeager Award, and some academic awards as well. Dr. Aceves is currently working on a range of research interests, including leadership, international aviation, and diversity initiatives in aviation. Dr. Aceves himself illustrates how diversity has become a critically important contributor to American aviation as an industry and its history. He's written this book chronicling the history of diversity in American aviation, in Chicanas and Chicanos, in aviation, overcoming barriers. And it's in part funded and supported by the U.S. Air Force, Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and the Alfred Allen Constancy Wolf Aviation Foundation, which I believe is quite prestigious as well. So please welcome Dr. Aceves.
Thank you, thank you. Is this a mic? Do we have a mic on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Pretty well, okay. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank everybody sharing your time with me today and this afternoon. And before I begin, I'd like to thank the Provost. Let's see if I can get this seat on. The Provost and the committee that selected me. I didn't know there was a selection process. I thought it was a strong suggestion from the Provost.
Provost never makes strong suggestions.
Okay. My name is Robert Aceves, and for the next hour and 15 minutes, an hour, I'm going to take you on a journey on my research and share with you excerpts from our Chicanas and Chicanos Overcoming Barriers manuscript. It's not a book yet, and I'll have some readings from it, though, the manuscripts. You will leave the session today with an understanding of how Mexican Americans have impacted U.S. aviation history, and you'll hear stories of individuals who overcame significant barriers to fulfill their dreams of flight. This research is designed to draw upon the human experiences of Chicanos and Chicanas, who, like myself, have overcome significant barriers in achieving successful careers in aviation, and who have made significant contributions in American history. The research highlights the lives of these individuals so that they may serve as a role model, heroes to students of color, as they are underrepresented in the mainstream of aviation culture, within an industry with a history of marginalizing men and women of color, and to bring their individual contributions to the forefront of the rich culture and heritage that is the history of flight in the U.S. Of course, none of these would be possible if it wasn't for, we mentioned our supporters. First of all, St. Cloud State University and the Alfred and Constantine Foundation, the Will Foundation, they worked really well. 3 years ago, they supported my sabbatical and funded my travels for all these adventures. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, who granted internal access to their databases and records, and then provided a backstage pass to the National Air Museum Paul E. Gerber Preservation and Restoration and Storage Facility. It's in Maryland. It's where they preserve, store aircraft, spaceships, and other artifacts and restore them back to their original period. So I had an opportunity to see some Apollo spaceships get in and look around. Pretty interesting, things that the general person doesn't have. The United States Air Force Enlisted Heritage Museum, who hosted my research at the Air Force Historical Research Agency. It's a repository for Air Force historical documents, where I spent a couple of weeks during the sweltering Alabama summer, it kind of sounds like here, allowing me to do some research through Air Force declassified personnel, flight, and squadron records from World War II all the way to the Vietnam conflict. So that was an interesting setup. To the University of Texas, I was very fortunate to visit and work with the World War II Latino History Project. I owe a very special thanks to Dr. Maggie Rivas Rodriguez, who developed the Latino and Latinas World War II History Project, for which much of my research is founded and who supplied many of the military photos that you're going to see today. It is significant to talk about the University of Austin and the work of Dr. Maggie Rodriguez. It says, in 2007, Dr. Rodriguez went toe-to-toe with Ken Burns. You know who Ken Burns is? A historic film historian. After he filmed a 14-hour World War II segment in 2007, it was brought to his attention that there was no mention of Latinos or Latinas anywhere in the film. No indication that they even served during the war. Dr. Rodriguez approached Mr. Burns and PBS to inform them that that not only were Americans serving in the war, but it was estimated that anywhere from 250 to 750,000 Hispanics served in the war. This large discrepancy is due to kind of the race categorization they had, because on their induction papers and their discharge papers said white, Mexican, or NA. So real hard to track. Mr. Burns initially responded very negatively to Maggie and said, it's kind of my film, do what I want to do, but Maggie decided to go take it on to the Latino Caucus, a group of 7 to 8 powerful Latino organizations, and they decided to visit some of the sponsorships of PBS as well as Mr. Burns. After they finished a visit with Pepsi and Anheuser-Busch and threatened a Latino boycott of all their products, kind of the week after, that same week, he conceded and decided to add a segment or addendum to to the film. While the additional footage is important, it is far from fair or truthful portrayal of the significant role that Latinos played in World War II, and also speaks to the need of my research. The Higher Education Amendment of 1992, Congress directed the Department of Education to enter into an appropriate arrangement with the National Academy of Sciences for a study of civilian aviation training programs. Congress wanted the study to discuss the implications of military downsizing, both for training and interested in ways of increasing the women and minorities in aviation, particularly high-skilled jobs as pilots, aviation mechanics. The study went on to show that in 1993, 101,000 people earned their living as pilots, 139,000 individuals earned their living as mechanics. Also found out that 92% of those pilots and 76 of those aircraft mechanics were white males. Make sense? Less than 2% of the pilots were black, and less than 3% were of Hispanic origin. Less than 3.5% of that group were women were female pilots, and less than 4% were aircraft mechanics. So in a group where white males portray 43% of the workforce at that time, it really was a strong disparity. Historically, the military had been an important source of trained professionals, especially for pilots for commercial aviation. Major carriers had relied on the military for about 75% of their pilots. As expected, the military aviation workforce is not noticeably different or more diverse than that of the civilian counterparts. Congress, in the years since aviation deregulation, has sought to examine the perceived problems in air transportation, in particular in the commercial airlines, specifically the concern about the continuing struggle for minorities and women to overcome barriers, prejudices, and historically have been restricted from aviation workplaces. If you look back, you'd have a difficult time finding a female or a person of color running an airline today. Like other industries, for many years, aviation provided only limited opportunities for non-whites and women. Explicit discrimination in hiring was accompanied by the internal culture that of being of commercial aviation gave to the heavy emphasis of male masculinity as a nature in order to be effective in aviation. Even today, key general and airline jobs, maintenance technicians and senior managements are still held by white males. This is frustrating for individuals who are from traditionally underrepresented groups who would like to fly or otherwise participate in this exciting field. Which has led Congress to wonder whether the aviation industry will be able to find workers with the white male workforce diminishing. Becoming smaller and smaller as historically, the source of many trained pilots and technicians emerging, what they want to do is find out we're having a workforce that's of white males that are actually decreasing, but yet we're not having an increase of people of color in the force, so what's going to happen to the industry? My research will offer significant contributions to the history of aviation and the importance of removing barriers to aviation for Hispanics. But what is more readily available is my intrinsic motivation for this research. As a tenured professor, right now at 2 universities, and I have 10,000 hours of flying, not 100,000 hours.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't your font.
I would consider my life very successful on what I've achieved. But the measurement of success isn't how one ends a career, it's about where we begin it. As Dr. Snyder stated earlier, I grew up on the fields of California. At 4 years old, I looked in amazement, and I fell in love with flying at age of 4, watching crop dusters coming overhead. But unlike many of my contemporaries, I was fortunate enough to have mentors in my life who supported the stages of my career development. For most students of color, especially Chicanos, these mentors are non-existent or at the periphery of aviation industry. Thus, lack of role models, success stories, or mentoring speaks directly to the Higher Education Act and the importance of moving general aviation industry towards inclusion and promotion of students of color in aviation. My objectives of this research is the identification of a population of Hispanic Chicano Americans who were successful in aviation. Survey that population and identify the sample who became barriers in order to kind of look at their goals and how they came to where they were. Conduct a qualitative oral history study, and then document the individual achievements in a textbook, which I'm working on Hispanic Americans for use in high schools, university, and military aviation curriculum. The Air Force has already offered to publish my textbook when it's over at no cost, but we're still working on that because there's no cost and there's no royalties, nor control. Okay. My methodology is a quantitative case study using written and oral histories as biographies. Why oral history? For fields that study marginalized groups, such as women, African Americans, and Latinos and Latinas, in this field, conducting and analyzing an interview is a way of uncovering experiences that might be underrepresented in the mainstream culture. The dominant culture in aviation for the last 110 years has been white males with a history of viewing minorities as a peripheral view. A marginalization of aviators of color. Consequently, only a modest number of records exist to document Chicanos or Hispanics' contribution to the aviation, and those are obscured in military history. It took a while to find some. Recently, the academic fields and institutions have emerged to explore the experiences of these marginalized groups and have placed a value on the experiential knowledge of the oral history project and the way of assessing this role. As an assessment tool, this methodology preserves the history that otherwise over time would be lost. As a process of reflection and remembrance, oral history opens up a space where past and present conceptions of aviation history coalesce. What is oral history? As new in research. Oral history is a systematic collection of living people's testimony about their own experiences. Oral history isn't gossip, it's not hearsay, it's not rumors. Oral historians attempt to verify their findings, analyze them, and place them in an accurate historical context. In oral history projects, an interview recalls the event. An interview records the interviewer records the recollections and creates a historical document. Just like that. That's my dad on the left. That's Maggie Rodriguez on the right. So they'll be in the book. You should note that the greatest challenge we have in oral history is the dependence on human memory and the spoken word. This means that the collection can vary from taking notes to hands to elaborate video or recording. Human lifespan places a boundary on the subject matter that we can collect with, that can be collected in oral history. Research can only go back a lifetime. So limits kind of move forward with each generation. With this particular project, many untold stories are being lost as our World War II Latinos and Latinos are passing away. We see the same issue, the same event going with our Tuskegee Airmen. And we've lost, 4 in the last 5 months, 6 months. But working a little oral history does give one sense of accomplishment. It's a sense to catch and hold of a treasured moment in time. And you keep it from the receding tides of past. So there is an achievement. There is a nice, and I would encourage other individuals, students in the room, to consider that. So now that I have oral history, what did I use? What kind of criteria decide how to work? The criteria I used to select the cases individuals required Chicano or Chicana history, preferably those in the flight deck. However, as I began to work throughout the World War II and Korean War eras, the women's role was not in the flight deck, but they were serving as mechanics, commonly known often as Rosie the Riveter, Rosita the Riveter if in Texas. And there was an African Rose, brothers that were never documented. Anybody ever heard of that name? See, those are obscured in our history. The Supreme Court Justice, Sotomayor, her mother was a Rosie the Riveter working on airplanes. Interesting. We're trying to get her on the Latino project. It's important to note that throughout this research, I have read hundreds of stories and heroines with Latino heritage and whom I wish to honor. But true to my research question, my study focused solely on aviators of American history and heritage. To my surprise, I found that most of the stories were from the military and closely mirrored many of my adventures or my experiences. The first question people ask me is, why did I focus on Chicanos and Chicanas? My answer is simple, I'm Chicano, and I want to find others who look like me. Next question is, what's a Chicano? It's a relative new term taken by people in the U.S. of Mexican heritage, descendancy, reflective of our unique culture. It was first used as a racial slur. used during the Bracero program. I'll talk about a little bit the Bracero program. The Bracero program began in August of 1942 when the United States and Mexico set up laws and a 5-year diplomatic agreement to import temporary workers to Mexico from the U.S. In essence, the Bracero program was designed to provide employment for Mexicans and cheap labor for Americans. The U.S. President, FDR, met with Mexican President Manuel Camacho to discuss Mexico as part of the Allies in World War II, as well as the Bracero program. Now take note that those are the Allies in World War II. Many people aren't aware that Mexico had a part they were allies in World War II. You don't see that. In 1947, the program was extended to include agriculture workers under a variety of law and administrative agreements. This Bracero program ended in 1964. It was during this time, 1947 to 64, that my family, like many thousands of others, came to the U.S. for agricultural migrant work. Chicano, the term seems to have come first and originated in the fields of California. The inability of the native Nahuatl speakers from Morales couldn't say Mexicanos, but they would say Mexicanos. And they were ridiculed, and they called them Chicanos. As such, it was insulting. Similar today to what the N-word is used. Mexican-American activists, however, began using it to self-identify, to take control of the word during the 60s and 70s, during the Brown Power movement down in the Southwest and in the Southwest. As such, today, a little more assimilated, I use the term assimilated Mexican-Americans, still find the term a little distasteful and a little dissavory, particularly because it's preferred by political activists and by those who seek to create a new and fresh identity for their culture rather than to subsume it blindly under the guise of the mainstream culture. Chicano, Chicanas can be spelled with an X or a C. Often you will see the @ sign to represent. After searching through literally hundreds and hundreds of stories, I've selected 25 individuals to document 2 separate books, a textbook and a child's book. I'm categorizing these case studies as by World War II, Korean War, the Vietnam War, and as well as space exploration. Today I will share with you some studies and excerpts and readings from my manuscript, all which provided service to the U.S. military. And after you hear about these individuals, we'll discuss some of the common themes that we discovered. First of all, Reinaldo Gallardo. He was once the captain of the Aztec Eagles, Esquadron 201. Myself and a Dr. Steve Casanova, a Chicano studies professor, interviewed Reinaldo here in August of 2008 at his home there in Texas. Phenomenal man. He described how he was the son of a Mexican general, and at 14 he fell in love with airplanes. He says he was crazy about flying from the first time he saw them. To be near airplanes, he would hang around the aviation camp at San Luis Potosí and going to school. And instead of going to school, he'd go out and ask the pilots if he could watch their airplanes. In return, they'd give him short flights around the airport. And by the time Mexico, in World War II in 1942, remember some of the Allies, by the time Mexico joined the Allies, he was already an experienced pilot. Looking back to the Bracero program and the Allies agreement. After receiving preliminary training in Mexico, Gallardo and his ship and his unit, the Squadron 201, were shipped off to the United States where they learned to fly P-47 Thunderbolts in Pocatello, Idaho. That's an interesting place, you know. Coincidentally, it's also the site where the American Women's Air Service pilot, the WASPs, also flew. He notes that every one of from his squadron was amazed to see how well women flew the P-47. They'd never seen female pilots. And in their air tactics, it was just... But in Idaho, the bad weather came and kind of forced them to start looking for someplace else to fly, somewhere south. They settled at Greenville, Texas. Let's talk about Greenville, Texas, in that area. Greenville's main street was decorated across the street with a banner that said, Greenville, Texas, the blackest land and the whitest people. Obviously, they did not like the Mexican Air Force coming in, and many of the wives of the pilots could not find places to stay because this town would not rent apartments to the wives or the families. Tired of the constant discrimination and harassment, Gallardo was returning from a sortie one day, and he flew over the town and saw that banner. So he decided to fly down the main street, and he took the banner out. He was put on temporary assignment in charge of the squadron mechanics and ground service. While deeply saddened to be away from his beloved flying, he knew he would someday fly again, and he did. Needless to say, the town folks were upset. They stormed the airfield and said, "We want to get the Mexicans out of here." You know, Arizona hasn't changed a whole lot, or Texas, has it? They insisted the squadron move out, but as the squadrons were training allies, part of the allies, and also part of the Bracero program, which was interwoven with the agreement, we think it really would have caused an international incident had they been moved out, because they weren't American citizens, they were visiting nationals. They were diplomats from another country. Well, the community was kind of shown the light by the military in Washington. An interesting note that after that, the tensions really eased a little bit. And I said that there was, so kind of, maybe he achieved his goal, I'd say. In March of '45, the squadron was shipped out to the Philippines, where they received additional, more intense training before being sent out to combat. As he recalls, we first went into action. We were serving with 3 U.S. squadrons and taking orders from American officers. The Americans looked down at us, at least a little bit, he recalls. They didn't say so, but I noticed it. We made up our minds that we wouldn't say anything, but instead we would show these people what we had. Not long after that, I had my first incident. On a combined U.S. sortie, Mexican-American sortie, Gallardo's mission was to disrupt the flow of Japanese troops and vehicles along a frequently used road. He recalled what happened next. We strafed a column of Japanese vehicles, and after I made my pass, I got a little crazy and did a celebratory roll. One of the pilots chastised him openly over the radio and called him and said, "Look at that crazy Mexican." Gallardo was offended by the comment, and what ensued was an in-flight tit-a-tat argument, which ended with a challenge to settle the argument behind the hangar after they landed. Gallardo had no idea which of the Americans he would soon be fighting. When they met, Gallardo realized that the guy was about 3 times as big and about 4 times as heavy as he was. He looked at me, grinned, and I asked if I still wanted to fight. I told him, "I'll fight you, you son of a gun." Fortunately for Gallardo, the fight turned out to be only a minor scrimmage. Afterwards, the 2 pilots shook hands, and impressed by Gallardo's spunk in the situation where he was hopelessly outnumbered, overmatched, the 2 became friends. In fact, this incident broke the ice and reduced the tension between the Mexican and American pilots. And from there on, the American and the Mexicans directed all their energies towards the Japanese rather than to each other. This is just a segment of what I've written in the book, but I want to close out with, and my manuscript covers a lot more as I'll progress here, but I want to talk about when we interviewed him, Captain Gallardo at 84 was still full of spunk, full of life, and in charge. A couple of hours into the interview, he both found out that we were both from Minnesota, Mexicans in Minnesota. And he suggested that we go out to a local grill or a local restaurant where they served great Mexican food and margaritas. So it was kind of, it was very historic. So he's just one character. Hector Santa Anna. From an interview with the World War II Historic Project, a descendant of the Mexican general Santa Anna, who led the siege in Alamo in 1836, Lieutenant Colonel Santa Anna was born in Miami, Arizona, a small mining town, on February 26, 1923. At age 17, Santana wanted to join the Army, but his father convinced him that college education was more important and he should do that before enlisting. He moved to California and worked as a miner, save enough money to go to college. And one day he decided to visit the Army Air Corps outside Oxnard and remember being captivated by the pilots there and what he saw. At that point, he decided, this is what I want to do. He enlisted in the Army in 42. He applied, was accepted into the flight program, and shipped off to San Antonio. Of the 97 cadets that graduated with Lieutenant Santana, he was the only Latino and the only Mexican American. He recalled the time he spent in San Antonio was not the best place to be if your name was Santana. I tell you right now, they must have thought I was returning to the scene of crime, he says. But there I am in the shadow of the Alamo, learning to fly B-17s, B-17 bombers, and thinking, maybe if General Santa Anna had had B-17s, history might have turned out differently. In an additional interview in 2003 for the Oral Project, he said there weren't many Latinos taking flight training as aviation cadets. And in his case, he said he was the only one, and it wasn't easy being the only one. They would always single you out, with a name like Santa Anna. You stood out. Some would expect you. Some would accept you, and others would not. He ended up being based in Sudbury, England, and flew 35 combat missions. He was awarded 5 Air Medals, 2 Distinguished Service Medals, and an Air Force Commendation Medal. During the war, he flew B-17s and C-54s in the Berlin airlift. He also logged 10,000 hours, a little over 10,000 hours of flight time, 20 years. After retiring, he went to work for NASA as an operations chief. Kind of with a chuckle, he admits that had he had the opportunity to go to the moon and walk around with those guys, other guys, he'd like to think they would have figured out a way to sneak off and with a big magic marker, go find a moon rock and write, "Remember the Alamo." Lieutenant Colonel Santa Anna was inspired by his father, who was a hard-working man who never smoked, never drank, and would always set an example for him. Colonel Santa Anna was renowned or known for saying, "We have a purpose in life, all of us, whether we are Hispanics or otherwise, and the one thing we should learn to do is to work with each other, to respect each other's needs, and try to understand other needs. Life is like laying out a flight plan for yourself. Know what you're going to do, know the route you're going to take, set up a schedule for that, and ensure that you make every single pass and every one of those points a major stepping stone for the next one." Here he is with his squadron that he flew with, and in Arlington, buried purposely so as a hero. Enrique Hank Cervantes. He was born in 1923 in Fresno, California. He's born as Enrique Chacho Rincon Cervantes. In an interview with Dr. Rodriguez in the World War II History Project, he says, "My stepfather, who raised us, taught us how to work hard, and he was a powerful worker. We often worked together, and when my brother, Gus, and my work didn't meet his standards, he came along behind us, never said a word, just did it properly. He taught us very strong work ethics," Cervantes explained. "And my mother taught us our moral groundings. Although Cervantes' mother never had a strong influence on him, she wasn't one to spur him on to follow his dreams." He says, "I shared my dreams of becoming a pilot one day with my mother as we were picking prunes, and she said, 'Good for you, now go back to work.'" Though she didn't verbally support Hank's dreams of aviation and becoming a pilot, she did push him to go to school and get his education. Ironically, it was at the school where Cervantes got his new English name, and it was inferred that English name was inferior. Very early on, when I was in first grade, he says, "My teacher taught me, we don't speak English here. Your name is not Enrique, it's Henry." He says, "I can still see my mother's face when my brother ran out and said, 'Chacho's got a new name, it's Henry.' And my mother just pursed her lips and didn't say a word." Miss Nealmeyer, his third grade teacher, is the one who planted the seeds of his dreams. On his 8th birthday, She gave him a card that said, "Dream your dreams upon a star, dream them high and dream them far. For these dreams we dream in youth, make us who we are." Pretty instrumental. It wasn't long after that birthday they heard about Charles Lindbergh's book, We. At that time it was a big seller, it just crossed the Atlantic. And he says, "The only reason I took the book out of the library," he said, "because it had pictures of airplanes. And while he didn't understand most of the words, the few parts that he did understand were about visions of fluffy white clouds, golden sunsets, comets streaking across the starry night. After reading the Lindbergh book, he said, I want to go up there so badly because I felt so ashamed of being Mexican, brown, and poor." His mother, not only did she encourage his education, but also speaking correct English and correct Spanish. She said, anytime she caught him speaking Spanglish, which is a Spanish English, she'd correct him and said, "People would think you're ignorant." Says, this is a lesson that he encourages today, even when he goes out and speaks at schools. He tells them to learn Spanish and learn it well. When he speaks in schools, he encourages the Latino students to be proud of their language and to speak it properly. It's important, he tells them, that you learn your language well. He predicts that one day, as we increase in numbers, more and more people will become prouder of their language and not be as reluctant to admit to being Mexican. Soon after he joined the Army, and while walking through a camp one day, he saw, soon after he joined the Army and walking through camp, he saw a sign on a building. I'll go back a little bit. Before he went in the Army, he decided he wanted to go into, I should probably add that, before he went in the Army, he tried out to go to the Navy flight school, the flight program. He went to the recruiter, and he was rejected because, as the gentleman told him, they don't accept people like him here. Soon after he joined the Army, and he was walking through a camp with a friend, and he saw a sign on a board announcing pilot testing. The way he tells it, he was walking past the building when the recruiter standing outside approached him and asked him if he wanted to take the pilot exam. His first reaction was, "No thank you," thinking, "I can't pass the pilot test." When the recruiter replied, "How do you know? You don't know unless you try." The recruiter finally persuaded him to take the test by selling him on the idea that if he scored high enough, they would at least let you work around the airplanes. He took the test, passed, and went off to flight school. In the Air Force, he found that discrimination was just as prevalent as back home. He was stationed in Arizona, close to the Mexican border. Though his rigorous training and discrimination he experienced on and off base, through it, he found it hard to stay committed to his cause, to his goal. But one day he found the added encouragement, added motivation. The way he says it is, they gave us 3 days off for Thanksgiving, so I went to Phoenix, to look around, and I saw a Mexican family sitting on a bench at a hotel. Mother, father, 3 kids, and their elder son. And he noticed the elder son was a brand new second lieutenant infantry officer. I'd never seen a Mexican officer before. He said he didn't even think he recalled seeing a sergeant. He'd seen lots and lots of privates, private airmen, sergeants. He said you could see the pride that lieutenant's mother had in him, in his family. His mom, his sisters, his dad were looking at him like he was a god. And he said, and he thought, just imagine, if you could do that for your family, imagine how proud they would be of you, or of me, as he said. He said, mud, fud, or blood, you're going to stay in this program even if it kills you. That's where he decided. It wasn't being easy because in Arizona, close to the border, you can imagine the slurs, the comments. It hasn't changed much, has it? Again. He just counted it as part of the price for being there and let it slide off my back. I never challenged anybody. I wanted that goal so badly. Cervantes went on to become a very highly decorated, many air medals, B-17 pilot during World War II. He flew 25 missions over Germany, served in Greenland, where he continued to to receive or experience discrimination in the service, the younger Anglo officers wouldn't take his orders. They didn't want him to succeed, as he puts it, and they'd question his achievements. He felt that they never really expected him to do well. Lieutenant Colonel wrote a book of his life, Piloto, Migrant Worker to Jet Pilot. In it, he describes what it's like to be a Mexican in an Anglo Air Force. During the trip to Mexico, after dropping bags off in the hotel, he went out for a walk to see some sights. As he walked, he began to take notice of a strange feeling. As he describes it, it was a tremendous sense of relief, like somebody had lifted a 50-pound sack off my back. He says he realized that because he was surrounded by Mexicans, and he didn't have to be so guarded. He didn't feel like he was being judged. It made him angry. He wanted to climb atop of a monument, face north, and say, "You gave me all these medals, and I have to come down here to feel like a man." With all the individuals in my research, Cervantes also felt that there were many people who didn't want him to succeed, but there were others who were willing to, in his words, extend their hands and help me succeed. This gentleman graduated with my sister in Stockton, so that's why I have to include Hosea. He was one of 4 children in a migrant family from Mexico. Hernandez, who didn't learn to speak English till he was 12, spent much of his childhood on what's called the migrant circuit there. What you do is you travel north in the March, and then you work south, and you hit the San Joaquin Valley. You hit the San Joaquin Valley about November, and then you start heading back south, as working the crops, tomatoes. You'd get down to Mexico for the Christmas, and in spring you'd start it over. Today, the NASA astronaut, Jose Hernandez, remembers exactly where he was when he heard the first Hispanic American had been chosen to travel in outer space. He said he was a senior in high school. He was hoeing and roast sugar beets in a field near Stockton, and he heard on his transistor radio that Dr. Franklin Chang Diaz had been selected at the astronaut corps. Those are kind of milestones. He said he was already interested in science, but at that moment, he knew he wanted to fly, and he could, and something that he has been striving for ever since. He attributes his success to perseverance. He received 11 rejection notices from NASA, and on the 12th application, he was accepted into the NASA program, candidate program. During the application process, he had to go through a review board. And that's where he came face to face with his original inspiration, Dr. Franklin Chang Diaz. He said it was kind of strange to find, he says, it was a strange place to find myself being evaluated by the person who gave me the motivation to get here in the first place. He says, I found that we actually had a lot of common experiences, similar upbringings, the same language issues. It built up his confidence. Any barriers that existed, he had already hurdled them. On August 28th, last year, he was a mission specialist, went up on the space shuttle, launched into orbit, and began into the history books. I found that interesting because that is the day that I stepped foot at York College. On September, after he returned in that same year, he politically advocated support of a legalization path for immigrants. Having 12 million undocumented people there means there's something wrong here with the system, and the system needs to be fixed. Hernandez called this kind of a personal opinion and not a representation of NASA. But even still, his remarks raised a lot of attention in the public and in NASA. And we think, would it receive the same opinion had he not been a person of color? Hernandez's success shows why migrants have risked their life to leave Mexico, crossing the borders, and to leave poverty. Interesting that during his time in space, millions of Mexicans watched him on television, and even many more followed him on Twitter, and so he's still on Twitter, where he dispatches messages in Spanish and in English. First gentleman to Twitter in outer space in Spanish. I'd like to end today with a little story of my own and point out some conclusions and commonalities that I have found in this research. My name is Roberto Isidoro Pereira Aceves. I'm a son of Rodriguez Cantana Aceves, Jose Rodriguez Cantana, my dad, Jesse Patricia Pereira Aceves. I was born in French Camp, actually the same hospital that Jose was born. I was the first of 4 children. I grew up in the neighborhoods in Stockton, as I mentioned. My first experiences of flying memories was accompanying my family along the tomato fields. At the age of 6, my dad, or my grandfather, I said that, who spoke broken English, took me at a local airport, local airstrip, and he went out and convinced the gentleman over there, to let me sit on an airplane. And I thought that was, I look back, and I think my entire life I can recall my grandfather speaking maybe a dozen English words in English. And there he is speaking to somebody to allow his grandson to get in an airplane. It was a guiding event in my life. I can say that's all I ever spoke about. That's all everyone heard about me. I wanted to fly. Years later, on my 16th birthday, my parents paid for my very first flight and gave me my very first logbook. I know now how much that cost and what the sacrifices it took to provide that for me. In high school, I wanted to join the Junior Air Force ROTC, but it was only held at another school on the other side of town, and you couldn't do cross enrollment at that time. I remember sitting outside the student dean's office, hearing my mom arguing with the principal and the dean successfully to allow me to enroll at the other school so I could participate in the Air Force Junior ROTC program. At 17, between my junior and senior year, I joined the Air Force Reserves and began training as an aircraft mechanic. I returned, finished my senior year in high school, and after graduation, I was given the opportunity to be a flight engineer on the C-5, the lower airplane on the left, world's largest airplane. A few years later, I transferred over to flying the KC-10, an air refueler, kind of fun airplane. Years later, at age 33, while working full-time, raising a family, I completed my undergraduate degree, and then the following year, finished my master's out of Embry-Riddle. After 20 years of serving full-time with the Air Force, I retired, pursued my doctorate degree, which I completed in 2006, earning my doctorate in school education, in school administration, pardon. The commonalities I found in all my research, a lot of this research, of hundreds of stories included, that's what I'll kind of look over, is the love of airplanes. We learn to love airplanes at a very early age. Family sacrifices, and a family push for education, facing discrimination and harassment, which created the barriers for a lot of success. Mentors. They all had mentors. We all had mentors who believed in them. And none strayed from their goals. No matter what the cost, they put their head down, went forward, and said, we're going to complete this. I want to talk about the impact my research has on York students for a moment and our community here. Mentorship is important because all of these individuals, including myself, would not have achieved their dreams had others not believed in us. Mentorship in this case is letting someone know that you believe in them. Mentors open doors and remind us that someone does believe in you. I'd like to end this with a little statement from Hank Cervantes.
On the morning of his 19th birthday, Hank became eligible to join the military. He eagerly went to the Naval Pre-Flight Training Office ready to fulfill his dream of becoming a pilot. Unfortunately, a uniformed lieutenant greeted Hank with the kind of words he would continue to hear throughout his life.
He said, "Young man, we don't take Filipinos, spics, or niggers in this program. If you'd like to join the United States Navy, I suggest you go down the hall. I think they're taking you guys as mess boys right now." Tears welled into my eyes. I tried to control my temper, but I couldn't. And at the top of my voice, I swore at him. I said exactly what you think I said, and I ran. As I sped back down the highway with tears of humiliation streaming from my eyes, I vowed to myself, people may think that because I'm Mexican, that I'll eat dirt. But whatever it takes, I'll prove them wrong.
Thank you. Now we'll open the forum for questions. Thank you.